One Control Port Podcast, episode 361. My name is Benjamin Yoder, and I'm here today to talk to you about video games. We're actually going to talk, this might be a long episode. We'll see. I'll try to make it quick, but we're going to be doing some very high-level game updates because I'm not really ready to talk about any individual game right now, but I just want to kind of give you a general update on where I'm at with game and stuff. I'm going to talk a little bit about actually a Nintendo video progress, just some thoughts from working on that a little bit. And then we're also going to be going to news stories. So the news stories will be on the back half of the episode. We're going to be talking about MediaVision, everybody's favorite, Wild Arms developer. What's going on there? We're going to be talking about some really interesting game business stuff in three different major categories. One is Koei Tecmo's push to AAA. Second is 4Gamer was giving like advice to indie developers on how to present their games at indie events in Japan. And then also Square Enix recently attended an event where they went pretty in depth about how they use AI in game development. And it's a really interesting set of articles because it's using AI in ways that I think is not the typical way we hear talk about with AI, in terms of just like, writing scripts or writing or like drawing or doing art and stuff like that, right? These kind of like high level human focused kind of job roles. It talks a little bit more about some more underlying aspects of game development and how they're utilizing it in that regard. So I thought that was kind of an interesting article to hear directly from a very specific use case actually that they give about how they're using it, which I thought was interesting. So anyways, but before we do that, guys, it's December. It's coming to the end of the year. We're going to have how many episodes? So we're going to have 3 episodes in December. This one that you listen to now, the 16th, and then the 30th. My plan is that the 30th will be the Game of the Year episode. If you don't know, when we do Game of the Year, I create a bunch of categories just off a whim, based off whatever I'm feeling. However, I also want categories from you. So if you want me to make respond to a category, let me know. You can make it whatever. I don't care. You don't have to think that hard about it. I will think harder about it than I probably should, but don't feel too scared. Just send me something. You're like, Ben, I want to know about this year. What were your experience with this? What do you like about this year in this regard, right? Like those kind of things. Who's your favorite character this year or something like that, right? Those kind of like general discussion points about just like, what about something that happened this year? If you can, try not to box me in too much with a question. Don't sit there and be like, like, what was your favorite MMO this year? It's going to be like, brother, there's only one that I played this year. So if you can, but, again, don't stress too much about it. Just send it if you're interested. Just let me know. What would you think would be interesting? What would you think would be an interesting game of the year category? Doesn't matter. I might mention it without even having a good answer. I don't care. Get that to me if you can. Let's say by the 23rd. I will remind you guys on the 16th, but the 23rd, let's say, will be the cutoff date of December. So feel free to comment on the YouTube video. Feel free to message me in Discord. Feel free to tweet or whatever the messages in Blue Sky, all those kind of things. Just feel free to get a hold of me however you want. You can do that. In the Discord channel, you can do that. You can at me and be like, Ben, do this. Do those things. Anyways, yeah. So to get into some games, so a lot has been happening in the game front. It might not sound like it. I know the outside perspective right now is that, Ben, you're playing a lot of Final Fantasy XI, which is true. But there's actually a lot more things going on. One is that we actually, in my multiplayer group, just recently finished Sanctum 2, which is like a first-person shooter tower defense game. We also finished up Wild Hearts, which is a Monster Hunter style game, one that I really, really enjoy. Mechanically, there's just a lot of great things about Wild Hearts. And so we've beaten both of them. However, we're not going to talk about those right now because kind of two things. One is Sanctum 2 has DLC, and we originally thought we were going to wait to play the DLC, But the Steam sales stuff came up and the DLC got cheap, so we went ahead and bought it all. And so we're like, maybe it just makes sense to go ahead and play through this now. So I think we're going to do that. So I'll wait till the DLC is done, and then I'll talk about the Sanctum 2 on the podcast at some point. Not that that's like in this audience's real interest, but I try to talk about every game I play on here because there's been too many times in my life where I will try not to talk about a game because I don't think it'd be interesting or because I want to save it for something else, and then realize later on I don't remember anything about it because I never did anything with it. So Wild Hearts, it's going to be a similar situation. It's going to be a little weird though because basically we have 2 weeks left to play Wild Hearts, and then the people I'm playing with are basically going to get scattered across the world for a little bit. And then we will not be able to reconvene until February. So I think there's kind of a feeling of just like, well, maybe we just kind of wrap up whatever we want to do now. And then anything we want to do, from there, we can just do on our own kind of thing, right? So I don't know if I'm going to do a lot of single player stuff in Wild Hearts post game, but we'll kind of see what we do this week and what ends up happening the next 2 weeks rather. So there's those things. Those are multiplayer games. Also, I kind of went on hiatus a little bit around the time of Portland Retro Game Expo, but I recently picked up Shining Blade again on the PSP. I've been working through the fan translation of that, which is not a complete fan translation. It is pretty heavily machine translation based, especially the back half of it. The back half is almost entirely machine translation. And that game, beyond the machine translation, has a lot of weird little issues that I think kind of underwhelmed me for a game that I thought would have been kind of interesting. However, so I've beaten the game, but one of the things that I feel like is true about Shining Resonance and also Valkyria Chronicles 2, a topic that's important because this game is built on that engine, is also from the same developer as a company. I don't know if it's the same dev team per se, but it's the same engine, same developer as a company. And Valkyria Chronicles 2 is a very character-focused game as well. And so I feel like Valkyria Chronicles 2 as a video game gets a lot stronger as you explore each individual character of its story. So I feel like I need to do that with this game. However, there is a little bit of a grind to exploring kind of the relationships with each character. And I don't know if it's because of the machine translation or if it's just kind of obscure, but like sometimes I feel like I don't understand if my relationship is progressing or if I'm not doing the right things to progress my relationship with characters and all that stuff. I got one true ending, or I don't know if you call it true. Like you can basically date like one of the 20 girls in the game or whatever. It's more than girls. There's some guys in there. I just don't know if you can actually romantically date them kind of thing. Like Shining Resonance was like, oh, there's guys. You're not going to like formally get together with them, but you and Agnum are going to go off on a map making adventure. And who knows what happens on that map-making adventure with you and Agnum, but you guys are going to go off together, just you and him kind of thing, right? Too scared to say, this is a relationship kind of thing, right? So I don't know if that's going to be the case with the guy characters in this game. This game came out, the Resonance was a PS3 game. This is a PSP game, so... Anyways, but the problem I was running into is like, I'm doing this grindy content and like sitting down and playing it on a PlayStation TV. I was just like, oh man, this is just like 40 minutes to an hour at a time, just sitting down and grinding this out. It's just a pain. And like, sometimes I don't even get new cutscenes. So it just feels like I kind of did nothing. And I was like, wait a second. This is a PSP game. And I was like, well, if I want like little tiny sessions where I'm doing something, just load this up on a PSP. And I did that, and it's working out pretty well so far. It still takes a while to load into Shining Blade if you just like cold, boot the system basically. However, the PSP does have like a sleep mode. I don't know how effective the sleep mode is on the PSP in terms of retaining battery. If I have to worry about like, if I have a session that I pause and then come back a day later, is the PSP dead? I don't really know yet. But it is nice to be able to just like turn it on and then all of a sudden, okay, I'm back in whatever I was doing basically. So that's a really nice aspect of Shining Blade. It was kind of funny because I was kind of like having two problems that I kind of ended up shifting on each other because like the issue I'm having with Polarium, the puzzle game on the DS, is like Polarium is a puzzle game on the DS, but I want the type of puzzle game it is makes me want to sit down and really focus on the puzzles for a while and really try to figure it out. So playing Polarium for like 2 to 3 minutes at a time, other than like it's a challenge mode or whatever, just doesn't really make a lot of sense. So I was just like, oh, what if I just like flip them around? So now I play Polarium for like 40 minutes to an hour. And then I play Shining Blade in the tiny little bits of my day. So, I don't know, we'll see. I only recently started doing it, so maybe it won't work out in the way I thought it was. But I was just like, oh, it's just one of those weird things I didn't really think about. Like, I think about puzzle games in these, like, short little burst thing. But this the puzzle mode that I'm in right now in Polarium is something I have to sit down and really think about things. So, and then Shining Blade is in a situation right now where I'm just grinding out random content and just hoping that's enough to like get the next cutscene, right? So it just kind of works out. And then finally, of course, because I can't not mention it, Final Fantasy XI. We got big update on Final Fantasy XI. I have officially set out to do everything that I wanted to do. I hit level 75 a few weeks ago, or a few months ago at this point. I don't know how long it's been. We talked about that. But also 75 being the cap of the game on this particular, I'm on a private server, a rollback server. The modern game goes beyond level 75, but for a while, level 75 was like the standard of Final Fantasy XI, and this server is based off that time frame. And the other thing I wanted to do was finish the main scenario and then Rise of the Zillart, which is the first expansion. And I finished Rise of the Zillart this weekend, which was very cool. However, one other thing I didn't really consider, but probably should have been included in there as well, is during, I don't know the exact time frame how this works, but there's this other scenario that got kind of put in after the main scenario, but like alongside Rise of the Zillart's content that I couldn't really remember it very well and like what was going on in there. And I think it was substantial enough that I was like, I want to finish this too. And it was like, because of how the game was working and like how I was just kind of progressing, it made sense for me to do that content kind of naturally alongside. And I did go ahead and finish that up as well. So I finished basically everything that I set out to do and then some, which is cool. So that did kind of leave me a little bit thinking, like, okay, well, does this mean Final Fantasy XI is something I push off my plate for good then right now? Or is this something that I want to continue to maintain to some extent, right? I've been playing it for like a year plus now, right? And, I'm trying to navigate that a little bit. One thing I did earlier this month, I believe, or maybe about a month ago, is I joined like an endgame group. And I think that was maybe not the right choice because it is a very time-consuming thing, and I haven't really been able to make time for them. And then also, there's another expansion that I don't really have a specific drive to be interested in checking it out right now, but it is something that, like, if I'm progressing, it just makes sense to go into, and if I'm just playing little bits at a time or something like that, it's not really a big deal if I just play that content. I have a friend that I is at the same part of that expansion with me, so it might make sense to just go through that with him. It's a long expansion. It's a good expansion, I will say, and it's been a long time since I've played that expansion, so I think it'd be a good experience. I just don't necessarily think that it's going to be a part of, like, nothing about that expansion I think really speaks to me in the sense of just, like, this would make sense for the video. I think I more or less have everything I need for the video right now. Even with the end game stuff of, like, getting together with 18 people to do content, was that a part of my Final Fantasy XI experience back in the day? Yes. And maybe if I were to do it, I would find that, there's reason for me to include a lot of discussion about that or analysis of that. But right now, I just don't feel like it's important right now. So I might come to regret that someday. But right now, at least, I feel okay with where I'm at. And who knows with how long that video is going to take to make. I think it is just one of those things where there will probably be plenty of time for me to reconsider it and change course. And like, because of how the video I think is going to be structured, I think I can kind of tack it on to the end without too much trouble with that if I wanted to. So, but one thing that happened today, just a little interesting tidbit, is that, so I finished that story that I was mentioning earlier, the kind of one that I wasn't really anticipating, and that has to deal with your, like, home nation. And so in Final Fantasy XI, there's like 3 home nations, basically, and it's really interesting because, like, as a kid, and I think a lot of people, you kind of get like an identity associated with your home nation in Final Fantasy XI, and I feel like, in the same way that, like, I think your job becomes part of your identity in Final Fantasy XI, like, the role you play in a party, I think a lot of people who play Final Fantasy XI, when they, like, represent their characters and stuff, they're often representing them in, like, very specific gear for their very specific job. And, like, I think about, there's this guy who used to run or used to be on a podcast called Limit Break Radio, and he was really disappointed when they, in Final Fantasy XIV, when they added Rogue or Thief, which is a main class of Final Fantasy XI, and that's, like, the class he identified with, but then it was, like, a weird, like, in-between class of Final Fantasy XIV to where you become a ninja, so you don't stay Rogue or Thief, and, like, that aesthetic of that character type was, like, really important to him. and it didn't really work out. But Final Fantasy 11 likes you glamour things, so you can kind of pretend to be a thief. Or Final Fantasy 14, Final Fantasy 11 does as well, but 14 is obviously a much more mainline thing. But anyways, I forget why I got down this line. Oh, your nation's kind of a big part of who you are, and so like the idea of changing my nation on original Final Fantasy 11, I think was like a very unlikely thing. I think I really thought too much about, because it's just like, well, I'm Sandorian. That's just who I am, right? And so it's really interesting because I did a different country on this server, and I don't really have the same reverence for them. I was mostly doing the country for the story content. So when it came to me finishing all the content for that nation, I was like, well, I guess I could like start another nation. And so I did that, which was, it wasn't a mistake, but I didn't really realize the consequences of that, because what it does mean is that you lose a lot of niceties that you had through building a relationship with your nation. And so you get put back down to rank 1, and the ability for you to warp to different outposts based off your nation suddenly becomes taken away from you. And also, there in this server in particular, there's the ability to warp to outposts from the main town, which is not something that really exists. I know if you haven't played Final Fantasy 11, that doesn't really make sense, and I can go too deep into it. But there's an additional teleport system on this particular server that that is reliant on you being in a certain rank, and that is taken away as well. And the niceties of that on this server is kind of like, oh god, I feel like I can't get anywhere. And like, even though you can, like, you still have your airship pass, so you can still fly around from town to town, but flying around from town to town, Final Fantasy 11 is not a short endeavor. It is like, depending on when the airship last left, it can be like a 15-minute wait of sitting there waiting for the airship, getting on the airship, flying on the airship, ending up in the next town and doing what you need to do. And so, yeah, it's a really interesting thing. But yeah, it kind of like limited me in a way that I was like, oh, I didn't really realize this was going to limit me. And it also takes away this like point pool you have where you can use it to kind of like get experience points, items, and things like that, or buy scrolls that will warp you back to town and things like that. And it's not really a huge deal where I'm at in the game. But it is interesting to like have that stuff taken away from you. So it's like, oh, I have no points. Now I have to like build them all back up through doing, different content that builds them up, or in primary, I think most people probably build them up just through like leveling up. But there's like this nation insignia that gets kind of put on you when you go out. And if you have it, it's like it'll last for like depending on a lot of factors, it'll last anywhere between like 2 to 10 hours. And so when you're killing stuff with that insignia on, then you get points for your nation. So anyways, so I think right now the answer is, I think what I am looking at is, I think I will, instead of doing the endgame stuff, basically replace that with doing this expansion content that I've been, like, I'm not super, like, feels necessary, but I am interested in doing it. We'll see how long that drive lasts. And then also, I am leveling Paladin right now, which is kind of its own fun thing on its own. But that's also kind of like, I'd say the more relaxing side of Final Fantasy 11, where it's just kind of like me doing my own thing and not having to worry about like what's going on in the rest of the world. Where it's like, I'm just going to sit down and do my leveling of Paladin for 2 to 3 hours, something like that, right? And like, I don't have to stress about it. Where like, when it comes to the expansion and like the missions and stuff, that requires planning, coordinating, and all that stuff, right? So anyways, that's my thought on Final Fantasy 11 right now. So before we get into the news here real quick, I'm just going to go to some Ko-fi stuff. Sorry, we're going to be a very selfish first half of this episode this week. Ko-fi, first and foremost, I forgot to bring up the list. I'm going to take a strong guess Demodori probably donated last month. And even if you didn't donate Demodori, even if you didn't, you've donated so much that I would be willing to continue to praise you for your donations even if you didn't donate. So what do you know? November, Demodori, you donated. Thank you so much. Again, also thank you to Conspicuous Snoop, who in October donated a large sum as well. So thank you both for supporting me. First and foremost, the Hot Pot Gaming video came out with Vink, so you go check that out. We talked about basically kids games, and that kind of also led into like how he uses video games as a part of his like family life to kind of build better relationship with his kids and things like that. I thought that was a really interesting conversation, so go check that out. Next week, there's also going to be a 64 Trump card collection review. This is that Alice in Wonderworld card game 64 game we talked about on the podcast a while ago. It's just a podcast highlight, so it's just a recording, like a video connected with, me talking about the game on the podcast kind of thing. And that's the only thing that's like really scheduled right now in terms of OCP Plus stuff, other than Hot Pot Gaming still happening monthly. I might do like a Switch pickups video kind of thing, because I actually did end up buying a good chunk of Switch games this Black Friday. So I just want to talk a little bit about those games that I picked up. I feel like I am kind of having oh dang, Switch is coming to an end, right? Maybe I should pick up the games that I'm like interested in. Not necessarily because I think like, I won't get them later, but it's kind of like, if these are the games I'm interested in, maybe I should just check them out. Maybe just check them out. Although Nintendo Labo is a special case of just like, yeah, I will not be able to get these later in the state that I might want them to be. So I did not get the VR kit though, because that seemed more pricey, and the other ones were quite a bit cheaper. So anyways, also, I worked on the Nintendo video. Yay! I started video editing that. I forget if I had started editing last time we talked, but I started working on that. I think I'm about like 7 to 8 minutes in on a 12 to 14 minute video. That sounds about right. It's a weird one to edit. I think I told you guys before, it's a strange video because it's like kind of a personal video that's more focused on me than it is video games and like my reception to a very particular time in Nintendo's history. So I don't know. It's a video that I don't know. Maybe, I don't know. I'd be curious what your thoughts are. If you do want to share your thoughts on it when it comes out, let me know. Cause I just don't know. It might be one of the things where it's too much about me. People are like, I don't care, Ben. Why aren't you showing me a cool ass video game? And, I was too busy talking about myself and Nintendo. Now, keen Ko-fi checkers will notice that the donation goal still hasn't been drained, and the reason for that is because I've only worked on the Nintendo video in my free time. That whole Ko-fi donation thing is about taking time away from my actual job to work on videos, because that is you actually paying me to do work. I have not done that yet. Unfortunately, it just like with Thanksgiving coming up, it got kind of crammy and stuff like that. I don't think anyone's like super waiting on it, but just I want you to know I'm not forgetting about it. It is just it just hasn't really been a good time to do it right now. So, but like I said, that money will only be spent if the intention was to work on normal work during that time frame. So, me working on the Nintendo video on the side on the weekend or in the evening or something like that does not fall into that pool of money that's there. So, anyways, I will continue to try to make a time for that. But I think, if I were to take, 2 sessions from, or 2 like 3-hour sessions out of this, pool of money kind of thing, I think that would be like, the math was that'd be like $100. I don't know the math of it. I would have to math it out later. Like what is the dollar per hour thing? I don't think I ever really decided that. I just promised like a full day or something like that. I think 2 more like 3-hour sessions would probably finish up the video itself. But then there's things like, the thumbnail, and then also, the actual like kind of top level editing of the video. There's more that goes on that's more than just laying down the footage. Right now I'm just laying down footage kind of thing. It's a really weird video to lay down footage for as well, because like I'm laying out a lot of just like general stuff about Nintendo, and it is very Nintendo focused, and it's very kind of like first party oriented, and it is very kind of mainstream discussion. So like it's a lot of footage of games that I don't really have a lot of gameplay of, because like in the last 10 years, I haven't been sitting down playing like Mario Kart DS or Nintendogs or, like, I don't know, Star Fox Assault or something. I don't know. Like I haven't been playing those kind of games very often. Even like the old stuff that I've talked about, like Super Mario Galaxy or something like that, right? That kind of stuff's just not really on my plate these days very often. So that's probably like what the video's about. It's like why I shifted away from that whole space. But it just makes, I'm going to have to capture more gameplay. Because I don't have a lot of footage of these games, which will be good, because if they ever do come up in the future, I can use that footage again. Hey, if you ever seen Mario Kart 3DS show up in a video, still using that same like 2 tracks that I've raced on that, and using the same little bit of footage. And you know what? I doubt any of you noticed. So, do you remember that in the Doraemon video that I used it there? Because we're going to use that little bit of footage yet again. So yeah, but it's coming along. It's a weird video though, and but I hope you enjoy it. And again, I'll be curious what your thoughts are. Maybe it's like a too hard of a swing away from, just doing video game stuff. But we'll find out. Thank you again, Demodori. Thank you again, Conspicuous Snoop, for your support for the channel. And I will update you guys as soon as I can about those work hours being converted to video hours. Let's get into the news. A bit of a lighter news story, although I think it's kind of interesting to talk about. So Shining Blade, we talked about that earlier, right? It is a game developed by MediaVision. MediaVision is a company that I have taken an interest in. I forget why I started taking an interest in it, but I feel like there's just like a lot of things that kind of like started overlaying on top of each other, and I was like, oh, why? Like a bunch of these games are MediaVision games. Valkyria Revolution, Valkyria Chronicles 4. Wizard of Oz Beyond the Yellow Brick Road. Wizard of Oz Beyond the Yellow Brick Road actually got really popular this last week, or like had a lot of coverage. I think there's a video that got like 150k views or something. Am I over exaggerating that? There's a video that got a lot of views. Maybe I shouldn't say 150k. I'm gonna try to look it up here real quick because I feel like the number was big, but maybe not that big. Wizard of Oz Beyond the Yellow Brick Road. My video got a little bit more traffic because of it, but that video's old and I don't have any personal feelings for that video. 260k videos, guy named CamoBot, which isn't like a big YouTuber or anything. He's got like 15k subscribers. The previous video has 120k videos, and that was by Casp, who has 35k subscribers. My video has 6.9k, and I've got 1.6k subscribers. So, yeah, I don't know. It's one of those things that I don't know how I feel about it because, A, I haven't watched their videos that much, so I'm not going to sit here and say that, like, I know what's going on. I feel like I watched the Casp video, and I watched it because I was, like, planning to make my own video at the time, and I was like, let me just make sure I'm not just saying the exact same thing he is. I was like, okay, good, I'm not. I worry with a title like The Wizard of Oz jaw-dropping DS RPG, and like the messages I saw about this was really focusing on the graphics of the game. I worry a little bit that this video is very focused on the graphics, but it is a 30-minute video, so there's a story segment. Okay, will I ever watch it? Probably not, but hopefully it did adjust it. If you watch the CamoBot Wizard of Oz video, let me know. I'm curious. I'm trying to be more considerate. If you watched it, let me know it's good. Because I will probably not watch a 30-minute video about a game I already played and made a video about. Unless, like, he said something super interesting. Again, let me know if you know that. That was not what we were supposed to be talking about. MediaVision, they are a cool developer. And we found out recently, I forget if it was on the Discord. I feel like somebody may have mentioned it. That they had, they're developing a game with the World End Club's developer called the 100-Line Last Defense Academy. Anyways, point being, MediaVision has been running a mobile game for a while called Meggido 72. Meggido 72 will be shutting down on March 9th, 2025. The reason why this matters is more of because I think for a very long time we're like, what is MediaVision doing? And the only thing I could really ever point to is this Meggido game. But it seems like that is finally starting to run out of steam. So they're shutting it down. It sounds like they're going to have some kind of offline version. In the machine translation from the Game Watch article, it seemed to say you could play the offline version, but just because I don't really know what that means and if the machine translation is accurate on that, I'm not going to say that it is like, hey, you can actually play the game offline, because a lot of the times with these offline versions of games, especially like very story-heavy games, I feel like it is just like, hey, check out these characters, check out their stories kind of thing, right? And not like actually playing the game very much. I could be wrong, but that's my impression of a lot of those kind of like offline versions of the games that don't seem to promise including gameplay. So not saying that's the case here. I don't know. But the article seemed to be worded in a way that sounded like it'd be playable offline. I just don't trust the machine translation. If you don't know, this is a game where you train 72 demons to save the world. That was my little quote on there. I don't know why I felt the need to include that, but yeah. MediaVision, I hope everything's all right with you. You're a cool company. On the bright side, though, if they were to die for any reason, I've got 8,000 MediaVision games to check out. Plenty of games to get bored of. Speaking of getting bored of stuff, have you gotten bored of talking about AI at this point? I think to most people, it's been kind of boring for a lot of different reasons. I think there's just like not a lot going on with it recently. There's kind of like a bump in development, and then also, all the I don't want to say drama, ethics concerns behind it. All that stuff kind of came into play as well. I'm not here to tell you how I feel about AI or anything like that. I will say maybe good, like, full disclosure, my job, a lot of my job time in the last decade has been around a company who does have automation stuff. So maybe that's a conflict of interest there. I don't know. I'm just letting you know. I don't think it is, but you decide. Anyway, so what was interesting though is Square Enix was talking at I forget what show it is, like CDEC or something like that, where they're talking about their AI usage in game development. And they kind of talked about it in 3 different categories. One being a little bit more in the kind of like, the way that I think people talk about it and why I think it like is very heavily frowned upon in the scenario writing kind of thing. And they basically were just like, yeah, we don't think this really works very well. Basically, they're talking about there's a lot of limitations, and a lot of times when you like try to create boundaries in the world, it has like unintended consequences. Like, for example, if they like try to create like a ethical or legal rule to the world, it doesn't necessarily implement in the way they expect. And so what happens is it creates these kind of like the thing that they were talking about was like discriminating against half elves or something like that. But the worldview it would bring in would not be a worldview that is related to the game. It'd be something related more to like real life and stuff like that. So it just didn't really fit with the game or whatever like that, right? And so like having difficult discussions about discrimination and things like that just didn't really work very well. It was very briefly touched on. They didn't go into a lot of detail about that. I just thought I'd bring that up first and foremost. But I think the probably most extensive thing they talked about was with QA testing with Emerald Saga. Is that the name of it? Emerald Saga? That sounds right. Emerald Saga. Saga Emerald Beyond. Okay, Saga Emerald Beyond. And they mostly were focusing on how they used it for QA testing. Basically, they were saying that one of the things that they thought was very appealing about at least this particular game, I don't know a lot about like the priorities of the Saga franchise as a whole. And again, all this is machine translated, so take all this with a grain of salt. The specifics might not necessarily be right. But they basically were saying QA testing can be really hard to create the scenarios when you have a very random world, essentially. Like the character development in Saga games can be very random in how they develop, and you don't have a lot of control over how a character develops and things like that. I'm sure it varies per game, but that seemed to be kind of the point they're trying to make. And so what they were doing is they're basically creating a combat scenario and like balancing it with initially humans. They'd kind of like set a standard of like what they want the encounter to look like. And then they basically have AI check the results. And instead of like directly integrating that tool into the game software itself, they basically created like a separate tool that kind of like prevent it from like holding back on the game's development, because this tool could be developed basically separately. And part of this whole process was giving them a little bit more flexibility in how they test stuff. One thing they talked a little bit about is that when you have like human test players, it can result in situations where a play tester can end up becoming too familiar with the game or too good at a game. And it kind of like distorts your view of like how balanced some content is because the person playing it has a lot more experience. But with AI, they found that there's different, like basically different like checkpoints of like that they could set of like how well the AI understood how the game worked. And they talked about there's like the initial stage of AI stuff where they're like, hey, the AI can't really figure out how to even play the game. So all it really does is try to do the most damage kind of thing. Then they have like a middle stage where the AI does like bad moves, but it starts to kind of like better understand, how the core mechanics start to work. And then the last stage is when basically it's better than most human players who are not already familiar with the game, basically. And then they mentioned the fact that like, and this is like somewhat common across a lot of different AI things you'll hear, is like it started creating strategies that humans don't necessarily create. And so it looks like incomprehensible on the top level, but then once you actually see what the result was, then it like starts to make sense. It just went through the problem in a way that a human doesn't necessarily think through a problem, kind of thing. And they said the sweet spot was the middle stage kind of thing, where they really wanted somebody who could be like a more intermediate player that has like some understanding of the game, be able to accomplish these scenarios, but not necessarily blow through them, kind of thing, right? And they talked about the fact that like when the AI could win 1 out of 10 times, that's when they kind of stopped having the AI further balance check it at that level, kind of thing. Because they ultimately believe that like at the end of the day, humans, when you're checking against that level, humans will be able to figure out strategies and skills that will overcome that fight as a whole, kind of thing. So it was a really interesting way of talking about using it, and part of it was just like, again, a lot of stuff with AI is about like basically saving time and things like that. They could basically test the thing they said was like 800 types of battles 10 times in 48 hours, and they could also test over the weekends, although I think they said that they couldn't necessarily test fully remote. They had to have somebody there this time, but they said they were working on getting it. But it was just kind of interesting to hear it be talked about in the context of this kind of like more general QA test kind of work, kind of thing. So I think the conclusion they came to, and this is a conclusion I think most people who utilize AI in the workplace probably come to the conclusion, if I utilize AI, it's a very similar kind of feeling where it's like at the same time, like it is helpful, but it really should only be used as like either a starting point or a general guideline. The ability for you to create a good product still relies on you. And so, you could create something that you think is like a good balance checker, but ultimately you still need to be the one to kind of make the calls on how that stuff plays out. And I think that's part of why they're like, hey, humans need to set the baseline of how this is going to work first and foremost before we just start running like an AI, tool through it, kind of thing. So, but yeah, they seemed pretty happy with it. They said at the end of the day, I mean, and this is true of everything, there's pros and cons that kind of come with it, but it was one of the cases where I felt like it was being talked about in an interesting way. And like one of the interesting things about these developer conferences and why I think some of the crypto talks and stuff can be interesting is that they're a little bit more, I think, straightforward with the types of discussions they're having about this stuff, because it is more about like talking with peers about, actually working with these tools and what they actually do and like what are the downsides and the upsides of them, kind of thing, right? And I think it's kind of interesting. So they don't really say if this is like something they're going to duplicate in another game, but they, at least from the article, from what I could tell, seem pretty happy with that approach. That was specifically about Emerald, what is it called? Emerald Beyond? Saga Emerald Beyond. The other thing they talked about is that they've created like an internal chatbot called Hisui-chan, I think is what it's called. There actually is like a little avatar for it. I don't know if it's like an actually person drew it or if it's like an AI generated one. And, I imagine any of you have, worked on a chatbot post and pre-AI kind of thing, right? So you generally know what's going on with there. And mostly what it does, and this is true of like knowledge bases and things like that, is that, you'll reference it in-house, or you'll reference like in-house documents and knowledge bases and try to, basically have it where somebody can type in, a more language-oriented way to parse information, where it's like, hey, I need to know how to do this. And rather than, specifically looking for like key terms that the user may not necessarily be aware of, kind of thing, right? So the reason they said that this was like a helpful tool seemed to be a little bit more about, and maybe it makes sense for Japan if you believe stereotypes and stuff like that, and maybe again, all machine translation, so maybe I'm misinterpreting this, but basically they're talking about trying to find information from people who either they're unsure of who they need to ask, or they might feel uncomfortable asking them, or difficult to ask a human, kind of things, what they said, which to me reads as kind of like uncomfortable to ask another person, but I don't actually know. So again, machine translation. We're using AI to translate this this AI article. And so anyways, I just thought that was a interesting set of things. They talked about mostly the QA testing stuff. I think the chatbot thing is and then also I think the scenario writing stuff and them having problems with that, I think ultimately make sense. I think these kind of use cases make a lot more sense than having AI uses that are more user-facing. That's not to say that this can't impact game design and things like that, right? In terms of like negatively. I think that absolutely can be the case. I think this, again, that's true with anything. But I was thinking about this recently because there's another Switch game that got announced. I think it's like a Japanese comedian called like Noda or something like that. And he has multiple games. I think it's like the third game. But they just announced like their most recent game, which is called Noda Game Maker, I think is what it's called. And it basically is a tool that you answer questions, and then after about like 60 seconds or something like that, it will generate a game, and you can play it based off the questions you asked. And it's kind of interesting. If you look at the game itself, and I'll have links and stuff for this, but like if you look at the game itself, like it has a very like Dojin game kind of look to it, right? It's all very crude, drawn kind of thing, sprite work. And you can make customizations to it, and I don't necessarily know, like, start to finish, like, how much of this is, like, you providing your own customizations or not. And, like, what is the broad set of tools that they're pulling from? Is it a limited palette, so all these games are going to look generally similar and things like that, right? But when I think about, like, Dojin games in particular, like, I think part of what's interesting about Dojin games is seeing somebody trying to figure something out, right? Like, when you're a professional, obviously you've been working on games for a really long time, or you went to school and stuff like that. And so it may not be as apparent, like, what is just like somebody figuring stuff out. Like, I like physics test Dojin games. I'm just like, I don't know, I need to make a physics test. And now you're a tapioca ball, and you're going to go get into the bubble tea, right? Like that kind of stuff, as stupid and small as it is, it's interesting. But when you put it in this scenario where it's like, oh, somebody can just like answer some questions, and then a game is generated, and then like, I don't know, like, okay, so now you have like an infinite number of like these games that I don't know what the appeal is here, right? Like that's not saying that I'm not saying that there is no appeal. I'm just saying that I think it breaks some of the appeal for me, where it's like I am, in some ways, with the Dojin game, I feel a lot more closer to the person making the game than I do other games, right? And so when you make the person making the game just be a computer kind of regurgitating stuff back at you, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that. Maybe something to talk about more in the future. I do not like this. Not in like a way like I'm offended, but like I look at this and I'm just like, well, on paper, like when I look at these screenshots, yeah, they look like a Dojin game. So I'd be like, oh yeah. Somebody's having a good time. And it's like, oh yeah, you just AI generate your Dojin game. And it's like, well, I don't know. It's like, I guess, does it matter if you don't know at the same time? In the case of Noda Game Maker, you will know because you're the one generating the game. Although I think they said you can share games as well. But, obviously if you're in that ecosystem, take a strong guess, you already know what you're getting into. So yeah. Get away from AI. Speaking of like Dojin creators and any games different creators, 4Gamer, which is one of the Japanese publications that we follow on this podcast, recently had an interesting article that was basically them saying like, hey, do you make video games? We want to see your video games. However, you need to make your video game look appealing for us to check out. So they're talking about basically how to set up a booth as a game creator in the most effective ways to attract a publication like 4Gamer, basically, right? Some of this is more like baseline technical stuff. Hey, don't have glare monitors with glare. Have non-glare glass on your monitors. So when people need to take pictures of screenshots, you can do that, right? So make sure if you're buying a monitor to show off your game, that you're doing. But then they also talk about like, hey, if you're creating an innovative work, when you're creating imagery for your booth, don't focus on your character. Don't like just put your anime girl up there. They talk about the fact that like, hey, yes, your anime girl might be cute, but they're just going to get like lumped in with all these other anime girls. And that makes sense if your character is your appeal. But they're like, but you really need to emphasize either the gameplay or the worldview kind of thing, right? And then there's like saying like your character can be a part of that, but it needs to be more than just your character, right? The example they gave was like, this is a cute character, but like the background's ominous, right? And not that I think that's particularly interesting, but I think they're trying to convey that like if you have like a horror game with a cute character, then you should represent that, right? And some of that's kind of straightforward, but I think it is interesting to say, hey, that's a question that you should be thinking about. Another thing they said is like, hey, if you're making an arcade style game, don't necessarily worry about making a whole arcade cabinet, but maybe like create a housing for the monitor that basically looks like an arcade machine. And the example they used is this one game that's kind of like based off of Joy Mecha Fight for the Famicom. I actually own a copy, but never played it actually. But they have like a little arcade booth kind of thing with it's just Famicom controllers that come out of it. But the aesthetics of it's like very arcadey kind of thing, right? They also talk about games that have kind of like a way that looks interesting to play. I was thinking about this recently because of the Nintendo video and the way of just like how Wii Sports is kind of this like very inviting game to play in a lot of ways, right? Like I think sometimes DDR looks really intimidating, and it's because I think DDR is not necessarily a very natural thing that happens. This doesn't come up in the video. This is me thinking separately, or at least right now it doesn't come up in the video. But like DDR and those kind of rhythm games that like have these physical elements to them where somebody does something impressive, it's still very intimidating when you see somebody do it. I don't look at DDR and say, I could do that, right? Where I think with like something like Wii Sports, you're up, you're moving, but I can do that, right? Like I can look at Wii Sports and say, I can do that. I think that's like something that's really important. And like, anyways, that's me. Ben just butted in with his own thoughts. But they're saying, if you have an interesting game to play, or if you want, let me roll that back. Make your game look interesting to play to other people kind of thing, right? And the example they use is actually one that we have talked about before when I went to Japan, where you like slap the game cartridges in a Famicom to basically make the game skip so you go over platforms and things like that. So like looks interesting to play from the outside. Although I thought there's like some really interesting advice there, like, but make sure it's like not embarrassing. You don't want people to be embarrassed. Also, make sure they won't mess up their hair. They won't mess up their clothes. You don't want them to be doing something that will make it feel like they can't be, they can't trust that they can maintain their appearance kind of thing, right? I thought that was like kind of an interesting little bit in there. They talked about like having a personal gimmick for yourself as a creator. I don't really know how I feel about some of these. Some of those like, hey, I've been creating a game for like 12 years, and here's my game that I've been developing for the last 12 years. And like, I think that might be a little bit more of a hook. Some of them are like, hey, when you show up at an event, like wear a wrestling mask every time. And I guess people will remember you. If you're wearing a wrestling mask and the only one wearing a wrestling mask at an event, people will remember you. So maybe that makes sense. But basically just make part of you part of like your booth kind of thing, right? Because it kind of creates a story around you. One of the things they mentioned was like one of the guys talked about, I think, did we talk about this on the podcast? I don't remember. There's a indie dev who went around Akihabara, and when you're in Akihabara, you'll get these little tissue packs and stuff like that, usually for like girls and things like that. So it's like, oh, come by and spend money at our bar where you drink with this girl, and then she, you spend money for both of you, which ultimately is like draining of your money because you're getting like you're basically paying for a date, right? That's basically what's going on, right? And then instead of that, they like handed out tissues with like QR codes to their video game and stuff like that, right? So they're talking about that person telling that story and like how they kind of lean into that when presenting their game. And then they had some stuff that was a little bit more, I think, traditional, where it was like, hey, if you have a game and you haven't showed it before, try to present it as a scoop to like publications like 4Gamer and things like that. Because if they feel like they can get an exclusive, they're going to put more effort into covering you and bringing you to kind of to the surface. If they think your game's interesting. And then also they said, and this is like one of those things where like this is like one of those things that like it can be a dangerous slope, I feel like, but I'm not a game developer, so what do I know? Is like focusing on trends and strategies kind of thing. Oh, sorry, I misread this. I'm correcting myself. I was thinking focus on trend and strategies, like, and then so like, oh, people are making a lot of Metroidvanias to make a Metroidvania, right? No, what they're saying is focus on trends and strategies of the publication. So if you see a publication publishing something that's similar to what you are creating, you reach out to them about that. Basically, know your audience, know the audience of the people you want to catch their eyes, basically. So, anyways, I thought it's just like, is that anything important? No, but I thought it was a really interesting article. Just them being like, hey guys, we know you guys make video games and it's a tough world out there. So here's some advice on how to get us to cover you. Koei Tecmo. Going from indie games to AAA budget games. Koei Tecmo plans to, I think, double the size of their company from 25,000 to, or 2,500 to 55,000, 2,500 to 5,000. I can say numbers. And they basically said they're going to lean more into AAA games, which is kind of strange. So they built a new AAA team, and that new AAA team is working on an unannounced AAA game, I believe. And they plan, and this comes from Automata Media, by the way. Automata Media has been doing a really good set of analysis of Koei Tecmo's plans, financial planning, and stuff like that. But they said they're going to focus on consoles over mobile, and they're going to lower their expectations for mobile, which is really interesting because previously they said they were focusing, or they reported that mobile revenue had gone up quite a bit. I did not link that, unfortunately, so I don't remember the exact terms, but I did look into this, and they did previously say that mobile was doing very well for them, is doing the best that it has ever gone for them. However, they say that they expect the console and PC market to grow, but they don't expect mobile to grow. Basically, they said a few different things. One with consoles and PCs, they said they're seeing new hardware releases, so I think that'll drive interest. And then also they talked about the fact that they talked about that they see console and or mobile gamers graduating basically to console and PC. They specifically noted in the Automata Media article that Koei Tecmo referenced the Chinese and Korean titles that they saw this trend happening. I did not look into those Chinese and Korean titles in specific to say what trend that is, but they did note that that was something that they analyzed from Chinese and Korean titles. So they basically said that the mobile market, in their eyes, is already matured, and they just think that even though they're doing well and have been growing, they think future growth seems unlikely. That was, I thought, really interesting. Although I will say that, and maybe this isn't something that we talked about before, I don't remember 100%, or the old article that they talked about their highest mobile game revenue. Oh, I did link it here. I just didn't actually put the information. The article where they talked about their mobile game revenue being up, they did say that they were going to focus on AAA games, which I don't remember if we discussed that point or not. So sorry if I did not, or if I forgot. But this made me think back to that old discussion we had. I forget if it was earlier this year or if it was last year. We were looking at the last 50 years of video game revenue and the fact that console market seemed to not really be improving that much. And mobile was, growing quite a bit. If you go look up like 50 years of video game revenue, you can look at it. There's one that's kind of during COVID and then one that's like right after COVID. And you can see, and I believe 2022, there's a pretty big drop in game revenue as a whole. I think just with COVID and everything that people were trying to get out, and so gaming was less of a priority. However, in 2023, the market did recover a little bit. But I did look into 2023's overall numbers, and it was interesting because the trends were mobile revenue was down 1.4%. Browser game revenue was down 17%. And then console was up 1.7% and PC was up 5.3%. I got this from a website called Newzoo. Let me see if they source exactly where. Games Market Reports and Forecasts. Which it looks like that's a paid service, so I can't look at the source. But they're reporting about this. And they basically said that downloaded and boxed PC games were up 5%, and then mobile games were down 1.4%. It's kind of interesting because mobile and browser were down, and I just didn't really expect that. So I don't know if we ever really looked at these 2023 numbers specifically. I feel like the last time we talked about this 2023 numbers were not out yet. So this is us kind of revisiting that. I think this includes worldwide. So I think this is not just US. And like, obviously each market's going to be different. I don't really know like, hey, what is the, console market in the US versus like China? Although apparently Nintendo's exiting the Chinese market, due to their Tencent deal expiring or something. So anyways, Point being is I just think that it's interesting to see. It's so weird. And I mean, part of this is like anything post-COVID, it's kind of a hard thing to analyze. It's weird to see that trend in mobile games just like turn around right after COVID, right? And I don't know if that's because maybe mobile and browser games got a extra level of inflated growth due to COVID versus console and PC, or if it's like a larger trend kind of thing, right? But I think we all agree. I mean, like 5.3% up on PC as a whole, it seems like a pretty big deal here. 17% down on browser seems like a pretty big deal as well, which I'd be really curious. I would be curious what those numbers look at and what are the games that matter in that space and where browser plays the biggest role. Because I know like, hey, DMM Games has like browser games and things like that, right? But I don't know like in the global games market, what is browser including? That being said, browser is like 1% of the market compared to these other things. So it's not like it's a huge thing. 1.9 billion compared to mobile games being $90 billion, right? Console games being 50 billion. Mobile game is still half of the market, right? But yeah, it'd be really curious to see how this goes. We're seeing companies like Square Enix as well say, hey, we're going to really invest in AAA. And it's weird because at the same time, I feel like we're having this messaging about like, hey, AAA is kind of unsustainable, right? And maybe it's like something that happens in between here where it's like maybe budgets get kind of reined in, but then also PC and console still matter quite a bit. I do think the traditional console space of like, having these very specific ecosystems based around different companies is probably gone at this point. Maybe the exception being Nintendo. But yeah. Anyways, interesting time in the game industry right now. There's also, I didn't talk about it here, but Microsoft for a while has been talking about portable stuff. And then also I think there was some talks recently that Sony was looking at doing a portable again as well. So, I don't know, really interesting time in the game industry. From like a business perspective kind of thing. And last but not least, we're going to talk a little bit about this interesting kind of article that was posted up. Again, everyone loves automatamedia.com. My favorite news website right now. Dragon Quest III Remake receives backlash in Japan because of mods, basically. Which basically, there is a series of mods you can download for I believe, the PC version of Dragon Quest III's Remake. And it basically helps like paste over a variety of different things in the game, add quality of life things, right? And the quote that they translated here in Automata Media was from a random dude on Japanese Twitter who basically said PC gamers are celebrating the fact that there are already a bunch of mods out for Dragon Quest III that makes it more user-friendly and whatnot. But I don't understand how you can casually alter someone else's work. It's the same as looking at an illustration and going, it sucked, so I fixed it for you kind of thing, right? Which I think I kind of get that comparison, I guess. But somebody else did like a retweet response on it, also in Japanese, and this Automatic Media translating it. So this is like actual translation as far as I'm aware. This can only be described as a cultural difference. Mod culture is an extension of the right to customize and fix a game product as a product you own, which is sometimes even encouraged by developers. But with Japanese games, there's a strong sense of the director's authority, and they're viewed more like personal works of art, which makes modding frowned upon. This whole thing made me think a little bit about emulation, and how with emulation, I remember when I first started using emulation, there's this feeling of the game isn't being represented in the proper way. And that's not because of how it looks per se or anything like that, but specifically because I was playing a lot of like very arcade style games or games from that era that were very arcade focused and utilizing save states, which does a pretty big impact on a game's balance, right? And I think at the time I was having a really hard time addressing like, okay, I use save states to play this arcade game, but at the same time I just wasn't having like a great time with it. but I also was like kind of removing the challenge to some extent, right? I mean, obviously it was still challenging, but it's just like I would rewind a little bit and like try it again, right? And it's like, well, you're still accomplishing the challenge, right? But I feel like there is a different thing with like, okay, well, now you're going to go back and try the jump again versus now you're going to have to try the whole level again if you run out of lives kind of thing, right? And it's one of those things that I think people can always say, well, obviously one or the other is objectively better or whatever. But ultimately, I think what you're doing is you're basically saying this is a part of the game I don't care enough about. And so I'm willing to take the sacrifice. And I think ideally the thought is that even if it was designed to be played this way, I would have even enjoyed it in this fashion because I don't want this to be a part of this experience in the first place, right? I don't want this, like, I don't want to be in high pressure situations where if I don't, don't make it with this last life, I have to start a whole world over again, right? But but you're losing a little bit of the stress of the situation, right? And I think this is how I kind of feel about all games in some ways, where like, I think anytime anyone designs a game a certain way, whether it be intentionally so, or even sometimes just the limitations of the system, right? It creates something that makes people feel a certain way, right? And if you start altering that, it's gonna make people feel different ways. I think the thing I always point back to is like Shadow of the Colossus and how like when I see Shadow of the Colossus running at a smooth 30 or 60 frames per second, Shadow of the Colossus looks wrong. And I don't necessarily mean that in the sense of like, oh, like this is a bad way to play the game or something. But like in my mind, there's something. I think the word that I've heard Tap Troop use about Evergrace once was like dreamlike. How Evergrace is dreamlike. I don't know if I necessarily understand what that means still in the context of what she said, but I would describe Shadow of the Colossus with like a chunky frame rate as creating a very dreamlike experience at times where it feels like things just aren't moving quite right? But it's stupid to say that if you think about it in the objective sense of the PS2 cannot keep up and it's just slowing the game down, right? But it's one of those things that like but like the way I react as a human is that like aesthetically this looks more appealing to me. And like if I didn't see that original version of it, that doesn't necessarily mean I would have liked the original version better if I saw it later, but I think it does take away something from how that game looks visually. That doesn't make the HD remakes bad or not worthwhile, or me saying that like you as a player playing Shadow of the Colossus should have to experience it with the frame rate, but that essence that I got from the game is gone. And, I think one of the beautiful things about original games being around and available for people to play on original hardware and stuff like that, or at least as close of an approximation as you can get to the original hardware release, is that you get to see that original experience as it was without the things that people changed later on to basically say that like we don't prioritize or value these things in games anymore, or we have recognized that this is a value that is undesirable and therefore we will cut it out of the game, right? So, anyways, kind of went off a rant there. But one thing I will say, one of the things I typically don't like talking about these kind of articles, because usually it's just like two tweets of people talking back and forth and like what it means to say like mod remake backlash in Japan. The original tweet has like 1.7 thousand likes, which is not a small amount, but not like huge. And then the follow-up tweet about the cultural differences got like 4,000 tweets or whatever, retweets or whatever. So like who is this representing and who's actually feeling this is kind of a different thing. That was, I think originally when I was bringing this on here, I thought it'd be kind of an interesting thought about like the difference between like US and Japanese perception of this kind of stuff. But at the same time, I also know that like, or maybe I shouldn't say I know the thing that people say is that like emulation and pirating games in Japan is like a very big no kind of thing. And so it's just not as well accepted. But I have seen like writers for Famitsu and 4Gamer stuff post like little emulation devices on their Twitters and things like that as well. So like obviously there's different people here making different decisions about things. And so I could see a space where as an American, I might say something similar to this, right? And then if it gets like 1.7 thousand likes, that doesn't necessarily mean I represent the American view of how people feel about this, right? So, but yeah, I thought it was just an interesting kind of comparison thing. I think this kind of maybe gets into the whole thing. I feel like I've been emphasizing this a lot the last like 2 years, like product versus art. Are video games products? Are they art? They're both, but how much you think it is one or the other kind of depends on who you are, right? And what it means for a game to be art. I think some people have kind of too hard of lines of that sometimes, where it's like, oh, if you're making a game that's art, it's got to look like El Shaddai, right? Where it's like, no, you can make Jeep Thrills. Jeep Thrills is art. Thank you so much for coming. OneControlWorld.com is the website. So yeah, like I said, if you guys are still listening right now, send me your Game of the Year ideas if you want me to say anything, and I will, try to work them in. I might modify them if I feel like I could answer them a little bit better in a different context. Ooh, my nose is starting to get a little runny again. It's like whenever I like finish being sick, like the sinuses and the coughing just like persists way longer than anything else. Even though I'm already done. But thank you again. Again, if you didn't watch that Famicom Geek podcast, go listen to that. I think it's a really good podcast. I have a episode for Hot Pot Gaming. I'm going to push it back a little bit, so it's going to be launching in the first week of the year rather than the last week of this. I just didn't want it going out like during the holidays, so shifting it to the first week of next of the upcoming January, basically. So that's coming up. Otherwise, also the Trump Card 64 collection video, check out for that this week. Otherwise, though, we're coming up in the holidays. I don't know what your guys' plans are. I think I'm going to mostly be staying at home. But, I hope you guys have good holidays coming up here shortly, and you're enjoying yourself. I don't know what I'm saying anymore. Welcome to the console website, and I hope you guys have a great week. Bye!